We have to go backwards. The very beginning of our episode, we started talking about something, and I cut you off so we could have some small talk. Time to revisit that again. The sweating the great drops of blood. You said it was by some L source. First, explain what L source is. In fact, go ahead and touch the sources Q and L and ABC, whatever. Okay, and let us know what all that is, what it means, and then put the microscope on those drops of blood and see if we can find any supernatural DNA there.
All right, we can certainly do that. Okay, so let's talk about what's called we can call the gospel problem, but we'll discuss it as how did Matthew and Luke form their gospel. It's important to bear in mind that all of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are written anonymously. That means that Luke does not end yours truly, Luke. Matthew doesn't say, and best wishes for a happy new year, Matthew. These are Roman Catholic traditions. These ascriptions of the Gospels are from the 2nd century, late 2nd century. That's where that's the source for it. I know that your printed Bible says St. Matthew, St. Mark, St. Luke, but that does not appear in the Greek manuscripts. So first, what does an L source mean? Okay, that's fairly simple. So although the Christian Bible begins with the book of Matthew, that appears to be the first book, and there's a reason why it was put first, but it was not put first because it was written chronologically first. The gospel of the 4 that was written earliest is the book of Mark. So almost all of the book of Mark appears in both Matthew and in Luke. So Matthew and Luke, whoever wrote them, we can certainly say a few things about them. We cannot say who wrote them, their names, despite what you're told in church. We cannot tell you where Mark was written. We have no idea. I know that some folk, the Coptics, think it was written there, and other people written in Rome. That the sources do not come from the Christian Bible, and they come from no source in the 1st century. That's a later ascription. That in fact that Mark was a secretary or a companion of Peter. What is important is that Matthew and Luke weren't just getting lucky where they were writing verbatim, word for word, what appears in Mark. Almost all of Mark appears in Matthew and Luke. So Matthew and Luke clearly were copying the book of Mark, almost all of it, with the exception of some 60 passages. It's all there. Okay. So that's one source for the book of Matthew and Luke. But Matthew and Luke also have, between them, they have approximately 275 passages, verses, that are common to each other. Right? For example, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That's common to each other, but do not appear in the book of Mark. In fact, the book of Mark, we're first introduced to Jesus as an adult. So the book of whoever wrote Mark didn't think there was anything unusual or remarkable about Jesus' birth or conception or the city in which he was born. So Matthew and Luke clearly were relying on another source for those passages which aren't common, but whoever wrote Mark did not have access to that source. And that source is called the source. It's called Q, which stands for the German word for source, Quell. Okay, so that's Q. Now, there are passages in the that's a Q source. Now, this Gospel of Q doesn't survive. We don't have it. All we have, whatever survives of Q, is in the Gospels. If it isn't in the Gospels, it's lost. Maybe they'll discover it tomorrow. We don't know, but we don't have it. Then we have passages that are only in the book of Matthew. So that means that these are things that developed in the community whoever wrote Matthew. And as I mentioned earlier, what we could be sure about Matthew and Luke is these were Christians who lived toward the end of the first century, who are highly literate, very well-trained, Greek-speaking Christians. It doesn't mean they just were literate in speaking and reading Greek, but they were also highly literate. They wrote really well. Luke's Greek is exquisite, particularly the beginning of Luke. So whoever wrote them, these are highly trained Greek-speaking Christians who lived towards the end of the first century. These were not illiterate disciples from the Galilee, which even Acts 4:13 says that some of the disciples just were completely unlettered, as would be expected from any person who came from a fishing village up in the Galilee. Whoever wrote Matthew and Luke, these are highly literate Christians. So you'll have things in Matthew, you'll have parts of Matthew that appear nowhere else. That means you won't find them in Mark, Luke, or John. Example, the parable of the sheep and the goats is unique to Matthew. The Sermon on the Mount is unique to Matthew. The killing of the innocents in Bethlehem, you could be sure that never happened, but that is unique to Matthew. The notion that when Jesus was crucified, we are told in Matthew 27 that at the very same time, the graves of Jerusalem opened and the dead resurrected came out. Just cemetery, just graves opened, and dead people started walking around the city introducing themselves to others. Now, if that would have happened, I think it would have made the newspapers. Well, that claim is only found in the book of Matthew. Again, if graves opened up in Jerusalem and dead people are walking, hey, there's grandma. Someone would have mentioned that. Philo would have, of course, but that's unique to Matthew.
I mean, Josephus would have said something.
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody would have said that. Would have definitely made the papers. I mean, that would have made. Josephus wasn't really a contemporary. Josephus was only born in the year 37. His writings are toward the end of the first century. But you would take someone like Philo, an example, an Alexandrian Jew, a Hellenistic Jew who was born in. He was born, I believe, in 11 BCE. He died in the 50s. He visited the land of Israel a number of times. He was a historian. If somebody sneezed and another person said Gesundheit, he wrote about it. I mean, he would have mentioned that. Would have been very, very significant. Okay, so that's actually a contemporary historian, writer, philosopher, commentator. He would not be considered Orthodox in the traditional sense. He was a Hellenistic Jew, but and Paul probably relied on Philo for many of his ideas. John's prologue, the Logos, very, very likely was plagiarized from Philo, but I'm not going to go there right now. Then there are things that we find only in the book of Luke that we don't find in Mark, we don't find in Matthew. And would be called an L source. L source would be the Emperor Caesar Augustus having a census of the empire, where Joseph and Mary have to go from Nazareth to Bethlehem because Joseph, we're told in Luke 1:27, was from the house of David. That's completely an L source. So that means that is deriving that whoever wrote Luke, there's a tradition building. It is almost certain that these individuals, incidentally, were not like whoever Matthew is, whoever this individual who wrote the book of Matthew, it's not like he just concocted everything. He has Mark in front of him. He has Q, this gospel that doesn't survive, but Luke knows about that gospel. Luke has that same gospel Q, has the same book of Mark in front of him. But then they have some other traditions that are developing, that have developed over years. And to give you a sense of years, we're talking about many years. In the ancient world, this was a very long time. If Jesus was crucified in the year 30, for example, so Mark is written about the year 70, 65, 70. That means that's a very long time. That's 40 years after the crucifixion. Matthew and Luke are writing about 15 years after Mark, and the book of John is written some 15 years, 10 to 15 years after Matthew and Luke. So what's happened over this enormous amount of time, and I say enormous, you go, well, is it really that big? Is it that large? So if something happened in 1930 and in 1980, well, in the ancient world, the average expected lifespan was, 30, 40, and people, that's 50 years in the ancient world is a much longer span of time than it would be in our world. Think about how many of you would be alive today if there were no antibiotics. Many of you would not be alive today. If some people did live, 70 years, it was certainly possible, but people often died of their teeth. They got an infection in their teeth and they died of the infection if their body couldn't fight it off. And that means if we're talking about the Greco-Roman period, which means we're talking about the period from, let's say, Greco-Roman basically would be from about 200 BCE to, let's say, 200 CE. So that 400-year period. The average expected lifespan was about 30 years. That's what you could probably expect to live. People just cut themselves, they got an infection, they died. Now, some people were in very good health and their bodies were able to fight off the infection and they would recover, but it was just people died of things very easily. And if this sounds unusual to you, in the year 1900, in the United States, the average expected lifespan was 42. Now it's something like 79, 80, right? It was 42. Now, granted, some of that, the average expected lifespan is reduced because of infant mortality. But still, in the ancient world, if a woman had 11 children, if 4 of them made it to adulthood, that was a big deal. So but getting back to our topic, there are things in the book of Luke that are found in none of the Gospels. Those will be called an L source. So I've given you examples. There is another example, and that's in Luke chapter 22, verse 44. Now, what's very striking about, I just want to contrast Mark and Luke's passion narrative for a moment. Passion narrative means the events of the crucifixion and leading up to it and so on. The difference is so striking, although many Christians don't notice it because of the way they read the Christian Bible. They read Matthew first, and that was very important to church fathers to get Matthew number one, because if you read Mark first, you would have, no nativity narrative, nothing, birth, virgin birth, Bethlehem, that's gone. You'd actually, in the early days, in Mark, you'd have no resurrection accounts. You have nothing past Mark chapter 16, verse 8. So putting Matthew before Mark just becomes a blur and then seems very similar, which it is, to Matthew. And it's sort of, what's missing sort of gets, people don't notice it. And then people read Luke. They read it from beginning to end. But if you took Mark's Garden of Gethsemane story that takes place in the Mount of Olives, it's so shockingly different than Luke. Because in Mark, Jesus is just absolutely beside himself. He is crying. He is falling on the floor, crying to God, asking again and again, take this cup from me, not as I will, you will. It means stop the show. That's what that means, take this cup. Which, of course, leads to the big question. What do you mean, stop the show? If he doesn't die for anybody's sins, then you don't have, like, bye-bye Christianity if Jesus dies of Alzheimer's. So therefore, what is he talking about? Moreover, we're told in the gospel that early on, that in Jesus' ministry, he is foretelling that he's going to suffer many things, go to Jerusalem, suffer many things, and then be crucified. But Mark really has a passion narrative where Jesus is falling on his face, he's crying, he's pleading with God, he's praying. It's a scene. And then what happens later, and this might be very important, is as Jesus is walking with the cross, dragging the cross to be crucified in Golgotha, Calvary, he is just absolutely stoic, silent, is nothing to say. He is absolutely beside himself. When he's finally on the cross, he is being mocked. He is absolutely shocked out of his, he's just silent. And then when he is crucified, we are told he cries out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's called the cry of dereliction. That is very, very different than Luke. Because if you go to Luke's passion narrative, you don't have any of that. Now, you do have in Luke where Jesus goes, take this cup from me, but it's very businesslike. He's not crying all over the place. He's in complete control of the situation around him. Very often people concentrate on the sort of the technical contradictions between the Gospels. Some of them are not significant or not really important. Some of them are enormously important. But I think the story here is the most shocking difference. If you read Luke, just read Luke through the Passion narrative, Jesus is in absolutely complete control of the situation. He knows what's going on. He's not anything. He's fine. And then when he's going to the cross, as he's walking, carrying his cross, there are women who are actually crying. And Jesus says to them, don't weep for me. Weep for yourself, for what's going to happen to your city. Complete control. He's up on the cross. He's not silent. And he's not wondering where he's going. He's having completely intelligent conversations with one of the thieves, with one of the criminals who are crucified with him. Now, this is again an L source. We're only in Luke. One of the thieves doesn't believe in Jesus, but one of them does, and asks Jesus, promise me I'll be with you. And Jesus promised me, he says, hey, you will be with me in paradise today. So Jesus knows exactly why he's up there, what he's doing there. He's having a very sober, intelligent conversations with one of the criminals. He knows exactly where he's going. He asks God to forgive the Jews because they don't know what they're doing. So Luke is completely different. In fact, Luke, the maxim about Luke's passion narrative is there is no passion. It means Jesus is not crying. He's in control. He knows exactly what he's doing at every stage. This is Luke's picture of the passion has no passion. Jesus is in control. It is so if you take Mark's passion narrative and Luke, just read them side by side, this will but people don't do that. Now, therefore, what later scribes found this troubling, and that is that they wanted Luke to have some passion in it, meaning they wanted Jesus to be in anguish. They wanted him to be something like Matthew and Mark. So they actually add in the verse that he, in verse 44 of chapter 22, where he's in absolute anguish, and he prays, and he's sweating, and literally drops of blood are falling to the ground. That's not found anywhere else. And it's also not found in some of the best earlier manuscripts of Luke. That was interpolated, that was put in by later scribes who found Luke's passion narrative to be lacking and inconsistent with the other Gospels. And that is an interpolation. And just so you know, that if you have like a really good Christian Bible, like a study Bible with an annotation, many of them will tell you that many of the earliest and best manuscripts of Luke just do not have Luke 22 verse 44. So the crying sweat and the sweating blood, which that's, by the way, where the line comes from. He's sweating, schwitzing, sweating blood, comes from Luke 22:44, but that's a later addition. But that's not like just a literary device. That was really needed, because if you remove that passage from Luke's narrative, if you just take that out, Luke's not crying, he's fine, he's doing great, he comes back, he finds the disciples sleeping, he has somewhat to sleepy. I mean, man's wholly in control. So that's what Luke 22:44 is. That's what the idea of that he's sweating drops of blood.
Wow, that is just so fully loaded. My gosh, the Q, L, all these sources. Most people really have no clue. I didn't have a clue until this past year that there was any outside sources. Figured it was just all, documented by the sincerely Luke, sincerely Matthew, Mark.
Right. So there are stories that are just thrown in, like the adulterous woman at the end of John 7 and early 8. Makes it into all the movies. Later, we know that, But this was really an interest of having Luke comport with the other Gospels. This is really an emergency interpolation to put something in, so therefore Luke would line up in some way with Mark and Matthew. So you'd have Jesus really very much in anguish, in distress, sweating blood.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפץ הכל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפץ הכל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה בתפארה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפץ הכל אזי מלך שמו נקרא